He was locked away, a war-trained German shepherd once destined for greatness, now chained, broken, and feared. Dozens tried to tame him, all failed, until a 12-year-old homeless boy walked into his cage, not with strength, but with silence. What happened next stunned a whole town, and what this dog did will change how you see love, trust, and second chances forever. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that even the most broken soul can still heal, if you believe no one is too small to make a difference, then hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the story ends. The wind howled across the open hills of Aspen Ridge, Wyoming, carrying the sharp bite of autumn. Dust swirled between the dried grass and rusted fences, and the scent of hay, leather, and old wood clung to the land like a memory that wouldn't fade. Nestled on the edge of town stood Claymore Ranch, a sprawling, immaculate estate of red barns, pristine paddocks, and money that smelled of control. Its owner, Mr. Vernon Claymore, was a man of spectacle and ego. In his early 60s, he was tall, square-jawed, always seen in crisp button-down shirts and polished boots, a gold belt buckle flashing under the Wyoming sun. A former rodeo star turned ranching mogul, Vernon now poured his wealth into racehorses and retired military dogs. Less out of love, more out of pride. He liked things that won. He liked things that obeyed. But one creature on his estate did neither. In a separate enclosure behind the third barn, where few ventured and fewer lingered, lived Ranger. Once known as Tango, Ranger was a large German shepherd with a storm-gray coat streaked in black and tan, amber eyes always alert. He had once been trained for military deployment, fast, smart, deadly. But something had gone wrong overseas. Details were vague. Some said a mission failed. Others whispered about a roadside explosion that had shattered more than just bones. Whatever it was, Ranger had been deemed unfit and was sold off at a government auction. Vernon bid high, thinking he had found the perfect symbol of power. He renamed the dog Ranger in homage to elite warriors. But no name could change what trauma had already carved deep into the animal's soul. Now, Ranger snarled at anyone who got within 10 feet of his pen. His teeth bared in instinct, not choice. Ranch hands refused to feed him directly. They left meat in a metal tray and slipped away. He hadn't been touched in nearly 2 years. Vernon kept him for image, not function, a fierce animal in a cage, a warning to anyone who forgot who ran this land. But not everyone was afraid of Ranger. From the broken fence post just outside the pen, Caleb Reed, age 12, would often sit and hum. Caleb was small for his age, thin from too many skipped meals, with sun-darkened skin and a pair of denim overalls 2 sizes too big. His hair was chestnut brown, overgrown and uneven, as though cut with kitchen scissors. Since his mother had died in a car crash when he was 9, Caleb had bounced between shelters, kind strangers, and the musty attic of St. Agnes Church, where Father Emmett let him sleep in exchange for odd jobs. Most days, Caleb wandered. He stayed quiet, listened more than he spoke. Aspen Ridge wasn't kind to strays, but something about the quiet wind and the smell of animals drew him to Claymore Ranch, where the fields were wide and the fences barely noticed a boy like him slipping past. He'd discovered Ranger by accident. One afternoon, trying to dodge a ranch worker's glare, he ducked behind the last barn and heard the low, thunderous growl. But instead of running, Caleb looked and saw not a beast, but a creature caged by something far crueler than bars. From then on, he returned often, never too close, just enough. He'd sit cross-legged in the dirt, just outside the outer fence, and sing, not loudly, not to provoke, but softly, songs his mother used to hum while doing dishes or brushing his hair. Old songs, mountain folk ballads, lullabies, whispers from another life. His voice cracked sometimes, but it was warm, full of memory. The words weren't for anyone else, only for him, and somehow, for Ranger. And Ranger listened. He never barked, never lunged. His ears would twitch, his body still. And slowly, over the days, his gaze would soften, not with trust, but recognition. Something passed between them in those moments. A boy without a home, a dog without peace. No one noticed. No one except the wind and the trees and the sky growing heavier with clouds. And one night, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and Caleb rose to leave, Ranger let out a single, low whine, the kind of sound you only make when you remember what it felt like to not be alone. It began with laughter, cold, guttural, echoing through the barn, like the sound of boots on brittle glass. Mr. Vernon Claymore stood in his private office, a glass of dark rye in one hand, his other hand flipping through the day's ranch log. His office was more trophy room than workspace, framed photos of past rodeo wins, antique rifles mounted on cedar walls, a bearskin rug sprawled near the fireplace. Vernon's eyes sparkled with something that wasn't joy, closer to mischief wrapped in cruelty. He had just received word from George McKinley about the stray boy who'd been seen sitting by Ranger's pen, humming lullabies like a fool. Vernon leaned back in his leather chair and smirked. "Well," he muttered, "if the dog wants a lullaby, let's give him a symphony." The next morning, he summoned Marla Dean, his ranch secretary. Marla was in her early 40s, short and stocky, with auburn curls always tied in a bun. Her expression rarely changed, stern, unsmiling, efficient. Rumor said she once managed a casino's floor security in Reno before trading dice for dust and settling down in Wyoming. Vernon liked her for one reason: she never asked questions. "Put it in the paper," Vernon said, lighting a cigar, "and call in the radio station. I want the whole county to hear this." Marla raised an eyebrow. "Sir? 10,000 cash to anyone who can walk Ranger on a lead for 5 full minutes. No tricks, no sedation, just dog and man." He exhaled a ribbon of smoke, eyes gleaming. "Let's see if anyone still thinks that beast is misunderstood." Within 48 hours, the town of Aspen Ridge was buzzing. The Ranger Challenge, as it was soon dubbed, was mentioned on every porch, in every feed store and diner. Jeb McKinney, a retired Marine with tattoos up both arms and a limp from Afghanistan, was the first to try. Tall, lean, bald, with a voice like gravel, Jeb approached Ranger's pen with steady hands. "Dogs respect fearlessness," he said, tossing the leash over his shoulder. He lasted 14 seconds. Ranger lunged the moment the gate opened, knocking Jeb backward into the dirt, tearing the sleeve of his jacket and leaving him with 3 puncture wounds and a shattered pride. Next came Travis Kent, a self-proclaimed horse whisperer and traveling animal trainer. With his long blonde hair, cowboy boots, and confidence dripping like molasses, he swaggered to the pen and began whistling some country tune. "Animals know who's boss," he declared, unlocking the latch. He made it 9 seconds. Over the next few days, they came in droves, wannabe cowboys, off-duty cops, even a young woman from Cheyenne who claimed she had Reiki hands for traumatized canines. All left limping, shaking, or bleeding. Vernon watched them all from his balcony, swirling his whiskey like it was part of a stage show. "It's better than the county fair," he chuckled to Marla, who stood silently nearby, hiding her disapproval. But not everyone laughed. At St. Agnes Church, just off Main Street, Reverend Thomas Eldridge sat in the back pew, hands folded tightly, worry carved deep into his weathered features. Reverend Thomas was in his late 50s, thin as a rail, always wearing his well-pressed black coat and collar, regardless of the weather. He had kind eyes, pale blue, often rimmed red from sleepless nights. His sermons were known to be soft-spoken but piercing, rooted more in compassion than condemnation. He had known Caleb Reed since the boy first arrived, dragging a plastic bag of belongings and a face too tired for his age. Thomas gave him space, food, and dignity, but now he feared what was coming. "Caleb," the Reverend said gently, watching the boy scrub the floor of the modest chapel with a rag and bucket, "you've been going to that ranch often." Caleb paused but didn't look up. "Only sometimes. I've heard about this contest. You've seen Ranger. You know what he's capable of." Caleb finally turned to him. His voice was low but firm. "He's only like that when people treat him like a threat." Thomas sighed, adjusting his collar. "I worry about you. This isn't a game." Caleb stood. "I don't want to win money. I don't want to tame him." He looked toward the stained glass window depicting the Good Shepherd. "I just want to understand him." The Reverend said nothing more. He simply nodded, his heart torn between fear and something else, a flicker of hope. Back at Claymore Ranch, Vernon paced the barn corridor. amused by the line of contestants dwindling into nothing. No one had lasted more than 30 seconds. He loved the spectacle, the way the crowd gasped, the ranch hands whispered, the way Ranger reinforced the legend Vernon had built around him. But late that afternoon, a soft knock came on the barn's side door. George McKinley, his gray hair wind-tossed, opened it and found Caleb standing there, hands in his pockets, backpack slung low on his shoulder. "I heard you're giving people a chance with Ranger," Caleb said, not quite meeting the old man's eyes. George studied him for a long moment. "Boy, do you know what you're asking?" "I'm not asking for money. I just want to try." George chewed the inside of his cheek. "It's not my decision." "I know," Caleb said, then glanced toward the cage. "But I think Ranger already knows I'm not like the others." And behind the bars, in the fading amber light of early evening, Ranger was watching. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was waiting. It was a Saturday morning when Caleb returned to Claymore Ranch. The wind had stilled that day, but the air was thick with tension, like the moment before a thunderclap. Word had spread quickly that the boy from the church was going to try his luck with Ranger. The same Ranger who had sent grown men to the ER and broken one trainer's collarbone in 2 places. The same dog who hadn't let another living soul come close in nearly 3 years. The main barn had become a stage. Dozens gathered along the wooden fencing. Ranch hands leaned against posts, chewing on sunflower seeds. Locals parked their pickups by the cattle gates. Kids perched on hay bales, eyes wide. Even a few reporters from the local paper had shown up, scribbling in notepads with the eagerness of scavengers circling a carcass. Mr. Vernon Claymore stood by the far fence, arms folded over his chest, wearing his signature brown suede jacket and dark sunglasses. His expression was unreadable, but the smug curve at the corner of his mouth betrayed amusement. "Let's give the people a show," he muttered to Marla Dean, his secretary, who stood beside him holding a clipboard. "Maybe we should start charging for tickets." Caleb Reed arrived alone. He wore the same faded green hoodie, sleeves too long for his arms, and jeans with holes at both knees. His boots were second-hand and scuffed, soles nearly flapping, but he walked with calm resolve, eyes locked on the enclosure, not with fear, not with pride, just something quiet, something older than his years. Inside the reinforced pen, Ranger stood motionless. The big German shepherd's ears were forward, tail stiff behind him. His coat gleamed under the sun, thick sable-black fur, a faint scar across the bridge of his nose, and that ever-watchful stare, more human than animal. Caleb stopped a few paces from the gate and turned to George McKinley, who was leaning on the latch. George, in his usual flannel shirt and beat-up work gloves, looked down at the boy with a mix of caution and regret. "You sure about this, kid?" George asked, voice low. Caleb nodded. "I'm not here to win, just to talk." George sighed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts and good intentions don't stop teeth." Still, he unlocked the gate and let the boy through. The crowd hushed. Phones came up. Even Vernon leaned slightly forward. Caleb stepped into the pen with deliberate slowness. He didn't carry a leash. He didn't wear gloves. In his hand was a small bundle of hay, fresh, golden, and soft. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, just 10 feet from Ranger, placed the hay beside him, and didn't speak at first. Ranger's ears flicked. He stood still, nostrils flaring, tense as a drawn bow. The boy looked up and said, barely above a whisper, "I don't want anything from you." No reaction. Caleb set his hands in his lap. "I brought this," he gestured toward the hay. "Not 'cause you eat it. Just, it reminded me of where I used to sleep when we had the old barn. Before the crash." There was a shift in the crowd, awkward glances, a few chuckles. Vernon smirked. "The boy's talking nonsense," he muttered. But inside the pen, Ranger took a step forward. Caleb didn't flinch. "People say you're dangerous. I think you're just tired. I know what that feels like." The wind stirred. Ranger growled, deep, quiet, not threatening but wary. Caleb looked down, scooped a handful of dirt, and let it sift through his fingers. "When I lost my mom, they put me in this shelter with a room full of noise. Everyone wanted me to talk, to move on. But I didn't want noise. I just wanted someone to sit in the quiet with me." Ranger took another step, then another. Now he was 5 feet away. One of the ranch hands gasped. A woman near the fence covered her mouth. George moved his hand instinctively toward the gate lock, but didn't intervene. From the far side of the crowd stood June Mercer, a girl of 16 with a slender build, dark red hair tied in a braid, and a pale scar that traced just above her left eyebrow. She stood apart, arms folded tightly, her eyes never leaving the pen. June had once been bitten, not by Ranger, but by a different dog when she was 8. Since then, she had feared large dogs and avoided the ranch altogether. But when she heard about this boy and this dog, something compelled her to come. As Ranger approached Caleb, now only 2 feet away, June felt something inside her tighten, not fear, something else. She didn't understand it until Ranger stopped, looked at Caleb for a long moment, and then sat. Just sat, beside the boy. The entire barnyard seemed to forget how to breathe. Caleb reached slowly, his hand trembling ever so slightly, and placed it palm up on the dirt. Ranger didn't flinch. His ears softened. His tail gave a faint flick. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in trust, and gently nudged the boy's fingers with his nose. And that was when June began to cry. Not loudly, just a few tears that trailed silently down her cheeks, like rain on glass. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe because for the first time she saw a dangerous thing become soft. Or maybe because she saw herself in both of them, scared, scarred, and trying. Vernon pulled off his sunglasses, scowling. What the hell am I watching? No one answered, because for once, the boy and the beast had both found peace. The sky over Aspen Ridge that afternoon was a pale, translucent blue, so still it seemed almost painted. Sunlight scattered gold across the fields, and the last of the autumn leaves hung stubbornly on wind-shivered branches. In the center of Claymore Ranch, a moment hung just as suspended. Ranger, the German shepherd everyone feared, was seated beside a 12-year-old boy in the dirt, calm as a sleeping breeze. Caleb Reed didn't move. He let the silence speak for them. Then, slowly he rose to his feet. Ranger followed suit, muscles shifting beneath his thick coat, but his posture stayed soft, his gaze steady and unthreatening. The crowd, hushed as a church pew, watched in collective disbelief. Mr. Vernon Claymore broke the silence with a scoff. "Cute trick," he muttered, then louder. "All right, you had your moment, boy, now step back. We're done here." Caleb turned to him. "I don't want the money." The declaration startled the crowd. Vernon raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "I don't want your money," Caleb repeated, brushing dirt off his jeans. "I only want one thing." Vernon crossed his arms, smirking. "Let me guess. You want the dog." "No," Caleb said. "I want you to let him decide." There was a pause. Then chuckles rippled through the crowd, nervous, unsure. Vernon's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "You want the dog to choose?" he asked, voice thick with condescension. "Yes," Caleb said, steady. "If you're so sure he's yours, then prove it. Let him choose who to follow." For a moment, Vernon didn't answer. His jaw flexed, tongue pressing against the inside of his cheek. Then, with a mocking tilt of his head, he gestured grandly toward the space between them. "Fine," he said. "Let's entertain the fantasy." The crowd tensed. A few people leaned forward. Even George McKinley, standing off to the side with a shovel in one hand and a grease-streaked rag in the other, stopped breathing. Caleb stepped back and said nothing. He didn't pat his thigh, didn't whistle, didn't call. He simply waited. Ranger stood between them, eyes darting briefly between the two men. Then, without hesitation, he turned and padded over to Caleb, tail low but relaxed, ears tilted forward. When he reached the boy, he sat down at his feet, then leaned into his leg as if seeking anchor. A stunned murmur spread like fire through the onlookers. Vernon paled. "That proves nothing," he said, but the tremble in his voice betrayed him. George shifted his weight, looking to Vernon with a tight-lipped frown. "You said he was yours," George said quietly, "but he just told us otherwise." Before Vernon could respond, another voice rang out. "I think we've all just seen who Ranger belongs to," came the voice of Dr. Lily Hart, who stepped forward from the crowd. Lily was in her late 30s, tall and willowy with sharp cheekbones, curly dark hair pinned back beneath a tan sun hat, and eyes the color of storm water. A well-worn stethoscope hung loosely around her neck, and her clothes, jeans and a navy scrub top, were dusted with fur and hay. She was the only veterinarian within 40 miles who made house calls, and she carried a reputation for both skill and a blunt tongue. Vernon's face hardened. "Dr. Hart," he said curtly. Lily gave a nod, then addressed the crowd. "Some of you may not know this, but I treated Ranger when he first arrived here, about 3 years ago." "He didn't need a vet," Vernon snapped. "He needed training." Lily ignored him. "He came in with multiple stress-induced symptoms, muscle tremors, aggressive responses to sudden movement, extreme food guarding. These are classic signs of PTSD and canes." "Dogs don't get PTSD," Vernon growled. Lily looked at him squarely. "They do, actually, and Ranger's case was severe. I recommended a recovery protocol. Quiet, gentle exposure, trust rebuilding." "Which I followed," Vernon lied. "You isolated him in a cage and had ranch hands feed him with tongs," she said, her voice rising. "You treated him like a weapon." Gasps echoed. One of the ranch hands looked at his boots. Another woman covered her child's ears. Lily turned to the crowd. He was never going to recover under that kind of environment. But look at him now. All eyes turned to Caleb, who was now crouched beside Ranger, whispering something none of them could hear. The dog's eyes had softened. His tail thumped once. "This boy didn't train him," Lily said. "He saw him." Someone in the crowd clapped, then another, and another. The applause grew, not loud, not showy, but solid, like the creak of old floorboards under steady feet. Vernon didn't join in. "This is still my dog," he said. "I paid for him. I have the papers." Lily folded her arms. "And yet, the dog doesn't care." Vernon's jaw worked like a machine chewing iron. "He stays on my property," he said, then turned on his heel and stormed back toward the main house. George muttered, "Coward," under his breath. The crowd slowly dispersed, many glancing back over their shoulders at the boy and his dog. Some smiled, others whispered, but one thing was clear to all of them. Something had shifted. June Mercer lingered at the edge of the barn. She watched Caleb stroke Ranger's head, watched the dog melt into the touch like sunlight through a window. She didn't know Caleb well, not yet, but something about the way he moved, the stillness he carried, stuck with her. He wasn't trying to prove anything, he just was. And that, more than anything, had made the impossible happen. As she turned to leave, she whispered, "Maybe some cages are invisible, until someone sees through them." By the time the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods at the edge of Aspen Ridge, the buzz around Claymore Ranch had mostly died down. The town had returned to its slow rhythm, wind rustling dry leaves, porch swings creaking, and dogs barking in the distance. But somewhere quieter, on the outskirts of the town's eastern boundary, a new chapter began for both a boy and his dog. The forge was old, tucked between low hills and a winding creek. Built from stone and dark wood, the blacksmith's cottage had a slanted tin roof, stacks of firewood leaning under every window, and the faint smell of metal and smoke in the air. That was where Walt Morgan lived, and where, as of yesterday, so did Caleb and Ranger. Walt was a man of few words and fewer smiles. In his late 60s, he stood tall despite a limp that never quite left his right leg, the remnant of a service injury, long buried in desert sand and military silence. His beard was silver and thick, his eyes a steely blue that had once been sharp enough to lead men, but now softened with age and quiet grief. Walt had no family left. His wife Clara passed 5 winters ago, and he never spoke of children. The forge had become his world, his work, his language. When George McKinley approached him the day after the Ranger incident, asking if he'd be willing to give Caleb a place to stay, somewhere off Claymore's land, Walt didn't say yes immediately. He just nodded and said, "Kid pulls his weight, he can stay, but I don't feed freeloaders, even the 4-legged kind." Caleb understood. He arrived at the forge with a backpack, a pair of extra socks, and Ranger at his side. The dog seemed to sense the shift in environment immediately, ears alert, steps slower, tail swinging low, but not tight. Walt had built a modest pen behind the forge with hay and blankets, but that first night, Ranger slept on the porch, curled against the boy's feet. The days that followed were slow and honest. Walt taught Caleb the basics of blacksmithing, not with lectures, but through repetition. "Hammer falls straight," he'd mutter. "Metal's like people. Heat it too fast. It snaps." Caleb listened, watched, practiced. His hands blistered the first 3 days. By the 4th, he was wrapping handles in leather and shaping hooks with an even rhythm. Ranger, meanwhile, took to the land like he'd been waiting for it. He followed Caleb into the fields each morning, herding Walt's 3 retired horses, Betty, Rust, and Blue, when they wandered too far. He barked once at a fox near the chicken coop, then sat and watched for hours, tail twitching like a metronome. At night, he curled beside the hearth or under Caleb's bed, always close but never clingy. The forge became something more than a place to live. It became a haven, and they were not alone. Every afternoon, just as the sun tilted west, June Mercer began to stop by. At first, she stood at the fence, waving from afar. Then she came closer, leaning on the post, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her flannel shirt. June had always been shy. At 16, she was tall and slim, with warm hazel eyes and red hair usually tied into a messy braid. Her scar, just above her left eyebrow, was a souvenir from a childhood accident involving a neighbor's dog, one that had chased her across a barnyard and left her frightened of canines ever since. But Ranger was different. June watched him from a safe distance the first few days. Then Caleb offered her a worn sketchbook and a box of dull crayons. "He looks calmer when you're around," Caleb said. "You could draw him if you want." So she did. By the end of the week, June sat beside Caleb on the porch steps, legs crossed, notebook open on her lap. She sketched Ranger in different poses, sleeping, watching the horizon, nudging Caleb's hand. Sometimes Caleb would tell her stories about his mom's garden, the way she used to sing "You Are My Sunshine" while washing dishes, or the time they almost adopted a beagle from the shelter before everything fell apart. June listened, chin resting on her knees, eyes soft. In return, she spoke about her scar, how people thought she was fearless because she rode horses bareback and climbed onto barn roofs to get a better view of the sky. But truthfully, she'd been scared of dogs for years. Until she saw Caleb sit beside Ranger like they were made from the same silence. Walt watched all of this from the forge window. He never interfered. But one evening, as Caleb was polishing a horseshoe, Walt walked over and dropped an old, heavy book into the boy's lap. "Blacksmith's Journal belonged to my mentor," Walt said. "You write in it when you learn something, not just about metal, about life, too." Caleb opened the first blank page. Ranger rested his chin on the boy's foot. Later that night, as embers faded in the hearth, Caleb whispered to Ranger, "This is the first place that feels like mine." Ranger thumped his tail against the floorboards once. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't filled with riches. But the forge, the old man, the red-haired girl, and the once-feared dog, it was enough. A small home, a big friendship. And for the first time in years, neither Caleb nor Ranger felt like something broken. They felt belonging. The first frost came early that year. Aspen Ridge lay under a thin blanket of white, its fields shimmering under moonlight like powdered glass. The forge stood quiet on the edge of the woods, smoke drifting lazily from its stone chimney. Inside, Caleb slept curled on a straw mattress tucked into the loft. Ranger snuggled beside him, one ear always half-cocked, alert even in dreams. Walt Morgan had gone to bed early that night, as he always did. The old blacksmith's room was downstairs, near the hearth. He still kept a revolver in the drawer beside his bed, not out of fear, but old habit. Decades in the Army had taught him that peace was temporary and danger rarely knocked. Ranger stirred first. It was past midnight when the deep growl rumbled in his throat. The sound was low and guttural, instinctual, primal. Caleb woke instantly, sitting upright, heart pounding. Ranger was already on his feet, hackles raised, staring toward the small side window. Outside, 3 figures moved through the dark. They were dressed in black, their faces wrapped in scarves. One carried a looped rope, another a stun baton. The third held a large, padded duffel bag, far too big for tools. Their movements were practiced, coordinated. These weren't petty thieves. They were sent with purpose, and someone had paid them well. Ranger barked once, sharp and furious, the kind of bark that shattered stillness. Caleb jumped from bed. "Walt!" he shouted, scrambling down the ladder. "Outside!" The front door burst open before he reached it. Walt appeared, holding a heavy iron lantern in one hand and a rusted wrench in the other. He wore long johns under a wool coat hastily thrown on, and his eyes were burning with the kind of clarity that only came from soldiers waking to threat. "What is it?" he asked. They're here, for Ranger. From the back of the forge, another crash sounded, someone trying to open the pen. Walt grunted and pushed past the boy. Stay inside! But Caleb followed. Ranger had already sprinted toward the pen, barking furiously. The intruders paused, startled by the dog's sudden ferocity, but pressed forward. The one with the rope stepped in, tossing the loop like a lasso. It missed. Ranger darted aside and lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's padded forearm. The man howled, swinging wildly. The others turned toward the forge, only to find Walt standing there, lantern raised, casting fire-colored light over the scene. You boys lost? He growled, voice like gravel and smoke. The man with the baton took a step forward, but something else caught his eye. Flashlights. Dozens of them. From the main road, figures were approaching. Neighbors, townsfolk, ranch hands from miles around. Word had spread faster than fire. They came in coats and boots, wielding tools, flashlights, hammers, shovels, even one woman with a cast-iron skillet. At the front of the group stood Reverend Thomas Eldridge, his long black coat fluttering in the wind, a Bible tucked under one arm. The leader of the intruders froze. Thomas stepped forward into the open yard, standing between Walt and the shadows. He looked at the men, unblinking. This isn't about a dog anymore, he said, voice calm but unwavering. This is a lesson, for all of us, about kindness and justice, and what it means to belong somewhere. The man with the baton turned to run. The others followed. No one chased them, no one needed to. They ran like cowards, swallowed by trees and silence. Ranger stood at the edge of the pen, chest heaving, watching the darkness. Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. You're safe, he whispered, shaking. The townsfolk approached slowly, many still catching their breath. June was there too, wrapped in a scarf, her face pale with shock. She knelt beside Caleb and offered him a wool blanket she'd brought. Are you okay? She asked. I think we are now. Walt stood off to the side, watching the crowd. He said nothing, but his hand rested on Caleb's shoulder as the boy stood. Thomas turned to face the people. Tonight, we stood between harm and what's right, and that makes this forge more than just a place. It makes it part of who we are. Someone began clapping, then another, and another. Ranger sat quietly, tail wagging once, as if he too understood. Later that night, after the lanterns dimmed and the people went home, Walt reinforced the pen with extra bolts. He didn't say much, but before going inside, he turned to Caleb and nodded. You've got a town behind you now. That matters. Inside the forge, Caleb tucked Ranger into a bed of blankets and leaned against the wall, eyes wide open despite exhaustion. They had come for his dog. They had tried to take him away. But this time, he hadn't been alone. The courthouse in Aspen Ridge was a squat sandstone building with white columns stained by time and wind. It sat at the edge of Main Street, like a stubborn old man refusing to retire. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and dry paper, and the pew-style benches creaked under the weight of emotion and too many winter coats. Caleb sat in the front row, hands folded in his lap, trying to keep still. His green hoodie had been washed and pressed by Reverend Thomas the night before, and he wore a pair of borrowed slacks that didn't quite reach his ankles. Next to him sat Ben Keller, the attorney who had volunteered to take his case. Ben was in his early 40s, with dark curly hair going prematurely gray at the temples. He had sharp features and wore wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slid down the bridge of his nose. He was known in surrounding counties for his passion over polish, a man who preferred justice over formality. Rumor had it he'd once walked away from a six-figure law firm in Denver after defending a corporation he believed was guilty. Since then, he'd drifted town to town, taking odd cases for people with no means, no voice. When Walt had asked if anyone knew a good lawyer, it was Reverend Thomas who wrote to Ben, and Ben had shown up without fanfare, setting up a small desk in the church library, saying simply, "Let's get to work." Opposite them sat Vernon Claymore, arms crossed tightly across his chest. He wore a sharp gray suit with silver cufflinks, his boots polished to a dull gleam. His lawyer, Richard Morton, was a tall, narrow-faced man in his 50s, with a deep baritone voice and an affinity for expensive pens. His smile was tight-lipped, more weapon than welcome. Judge Margaret Hollis, a short, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s, with cropped white hair and square glasses, presided from the bench. Her robe was clean but slightly wrinkled, and her gaze missed nothing. "This hearing," she began, voice even and firm, "concerns the ownership and welfare of one German shepherd, currently referred to as Ranger. Parties present: Vernon Claymore, claimant and listed purchaser of the animal, and Caleb Reed, minor respondent, represented by counsel. Mr. Claymore, your side may begin." Morton stood smoothly, buttoning his suit. "Your Honor, the case is simple. Mr. Claymore legally purchased Ranger through a government auction. We have the registration papers, transfer of ownership, and vet records from the time of acquisition. Regardless of sentiment or emotional appeal, the law supports our claim." He placed a folder on the judge's desk with a soft click. Ben didn't flinch. When it was his turn, he rose and adjusted his sleeves. "Your Honor, we do not dispute the original purchase. What we challenge is the continued rightful ownership, based on the welfare and express choice of the animal, supported by eyewitnesses, professionals, and a remarkable series of events that call into question whether the claimant ever truly held ethical stewardship over the dog." Judge Hollis leaned back, steepling her fingers. "You're arguing for the dog's agency?" "Yes, ma'am," Ben said, "and the moral weight of care over contract." The next hour unfolded like a slow river through layered testimony. Dr. Lily Hart spoke first. Calm and clinical, she described Ranger's trauma, his recovery under Caleb's care, and her professional opinion that returning him to Claymore would cause psychological harm. Then came George McKinley, Walt, Reverend Thomas, and over 20 town residents, each offering personal accounts of seeing the change in Ranger, his bond with Caleb, his gentleness, his loyalty. Even June Mercer took the stand. She stood tall, her voice wavering only slightly. "I used to be terrified of dogs," she admitted, "but Ranger never hurt anyone unless he was afraid. And with Caleb, he's not afraid anymore. He's safe." Claymore rolled his eyes but said nothing. When the testimonies ended, Judge Hollis called for recess. The room buzzed with whispers, nervous feet, and tightly held breaths. Outside the courthouse, something extraordinary waited. Hundreds of drawings, pencil sketches, finger paintings, crayon posters, all taped to the wrought iron fence and windows of the courthouse. They depicted Ranger in all forms: heroic, smiling, sleeping beside Caleb, guarding the forge. Some drawings included bold words in bubble letters: "Justice for Ranger," or "Dogs choose with their hearts." June had started it. 2 days earlier, after overhearing her older brother mock Caleb's chances in court, she'd marched into school with paper, paint, and a mission. She told her art teacher, Miss Clara Jenkins, a petite woman with frizzy black hair and a voice that could quiet an auditorium, about the case. Miss Jenkins didn't hesitate. She made it a school-wide project. Even kids who'd never met Caleb wanted to help, because somewhere inside, they understood what it meant to love something and be afraid to lose it. By the time court resumed, the judge had taken note. Judge Hollis cleared her throat. "Given the complexity of testimonies, emotional impact, and potential consequences on the welfare of the animal, I am issuing a continuance. Further investigation is warranted before any final ruling." Morton looked annoyed. Claymore looked ready to spit nails. But Ben only nodded. Outside, Caleb walked through the crowd of drawings, Ranger at his side. The dog paused now and then, sniffing one sketch or nudging a paper flapping in the breeze. "They're not just pictures," June said softly, walking beside him. "They're proof that people are watching, that you're not alone." Caleb didn't speak. He just smiled, a rare, quiet thing. The law hadn't finished speaking yet, but the town already had. The courthouse was fuller than it had ever been. On that crisp morning in late autumn, the entire town of Aspen Ridge seemed to gather in the wooden benches, the aisles, even spilling into the hallway. The frost still clung to the windows, but the room buzzed with warmth, nervous, electric, like the moment before a storm breaks or a curtain rises. Caleb sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands folded in his lap, Ranger lying at his feet. The German shepherd, now visibly more at ease than the restless creature he had once been, kept his head rested across Caleb's boots. His black and tan coat shimmered under the courtroom lights, and his ears twitched slightly with every cough or creak. But he was calm, grounded, anchored not by a leash, but by something invisible and stronger. Next to Caleb stood Ben Keller, his suit slightly more wrinkled than last time, his tie crooked in a way that suggested he'd dressed in the dark after a long night reviewing notes. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, determined. Opposite them, Vernon Claymore sat stone still, arms crossed tightly, his lawyer Richard Morton whispering something in his ear. Claymore didn't respond. His face was flushed, not from embarrassment, but something closer to quiet fury. This wasn't the empire he'd built. This was the beginning of its unraveling. Presiding was Judge Margaret Hollis, same stern features, same no-nonsense bun of white hair. Her gavel rested silent as she flipped through the last of the paperwork, eyes scanning with the precision of someone who had seen every kind of lie before breakfast. After reviewing the testimonies, she began, her voice clear and echoing, and with the addition of supplemental materials submitted by the respondent's counsel, including video evidence and character references from licensed professionals, I have come to a decision. You could have heard a pin drop. Ben placed a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. Ranger stirred but did not rise. The original contract regarding the acquisition of Ranger by Mr. Vernon Claymore, Hollis continued, was conditional. Clause 6B, subsection C, as submitted by the auction house, specifies that the animal's ownership is subject to evaluation within a probationary period of 6 months if the dog exhibits signs of psychological distress or instability. She looked over the rim of her glasses. That clause was neither voided nor formally contested. Morton shifted uncomfortably. Vernon's jaw locked tighter. Furthermore, Judge Hollis added, the submitted video from the day in question clearly shows the animal choosing to follow the respondent, Caleb Reed, of his own volition. This evidence, combined with professional testimony and the animal's improved behavioral record, is sufficient for this court to determine a transfer of guardianship. She paused. Therefore, legal custody and full ownership of Ranger is awarded to Caleb Reed, effective immediately. The room didn't explode in cheers. It breathed, a collective exhale after weeks of holding it in. Then the clapping began, soft, hesitant, and grew louder, spreading like a wildfire of relief. Caleb's eyes widened, then flooded. He buried his face into Ranger's neck. The dog licked his ear once, then pressed closer, tail wagging slowly. Claymore stood up. "This is a circus," he muttered, but Judge Hollis banged her gavel once. "Mr. Claymore, you are excused." He left without another word, pushing past the townsfolk without meeting a single gaze. Outside, the sky was painted with streaks of orange and gold. The town had prepared a small celebration. Nothing extravagant, just long tables set up in the square, homemade pies, pumpkin bread, cider barrels, and hand-painted signs from the children still fluttering on fence posts. At the center of it all was June Mercer, holding a poster that read, "Welcome home, Ranger." Her braid was tucked beneath a knitted beanie, and her cheeks were flushed from both cold and excitement. She grinned when she saw Caleb and ran to meet him. "You did it," she said, breathless. "No," Caleb replied, kneeling to scratch Ranger behind the ears. "We did." Walt Morgan approached next. He walked slowly, but there was pride in the way he stood, back straight, jaw firm. In his gloved hands was a small box wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Caleb without ceremony. "What's this?" Caleb asked. Walt nodded toward Ranger. "Something that belongs to both of you." Caleb unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a handcrafted leather collar, the leather dark and oiled, the stitching meticulous. Etched into a brass plate at the center were the words, "Ranger, loyal by choice, not by force." Caleb stared at it, lips parting, but unable to speak. Walt shifted his stance. Figured he earned it. Caleb choked back a tear, then gently slipped the collar around Ranger's neck. It fit perfectly. The dog sat tall and still as it was fastened, almost regal in his calm. People began to gather, some snapping photos, others simply watching, grinning, nodding, brushing away tears they pretended weren't there. Miss Clara Jenkins handed out apple cider. George McKinley played his harmonica near the fire barrels. Reverend Thomas stood with his hands behind his back, watching with silent gratitude. As the sun began to sink behind the ridge, casting long shadows and golden light across the square, Caleb stood beside Ranger on the edge of the crowd. He looked to the horizon. Then, with a slow breath, he whispered, Ready to go home, boy? Ranger barked once, short, joyful, and the two began to walk, side by side, down the road toward the forge. They didn't rush. They didn't look back. Two souls who had once been lost, now found in one another. And as they disappeared into the light, the brass plate on Ranger's collar caught the last glint of the sun, shining like a medal not of war, but of peace hard-earned. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with lightning or thunder. They arrive quietly, on four paws, or in the form of a boy no one believed in. Caleb and Ranger were both forgotten, wounded by a world that moved too fast and cared too little. But through faith, compassion, and the courage to keep showing up, they found each other. This story reminds us that God often works through the overlooked, the abandoned, the brokenhearted. He doesn't always part seas. Sometimes, he simply opens a door and places the right soul on the other side. In Caleb's quiet strength and Ranger's silent loyalty, we see the hands of a loving creator shaping a bond that no contract or courtroom could deny. Maybe you're like Caleb, waiting for someone to see your worth. Or maybe you're like Ranger, longing to trust again. Whatever your story, never forget, God hasn't forgotten you. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and tell us what part moved you the most. And if you believe that love can heal, that loyalty is chosen, and that second chances are holy, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let's keep spreading stories that bring light to this world. May God bless you and your loved ones today and always.